Good evening and welcome to The Media, the Constitution, and the 2016 Race, a post-election panel. My name is Joseph Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement, and your host for this evening. The 2016 presidential election was one to remember, to say the least. From caucus season to election day, America was met with one surprise after another, ending in a result that seemed to shock the nation and the world. Electing Republican Donald Trump, who won 306 electoral votes but lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton. Iowa's role in the race was as prominent as ever, holding the first in the nation caucus, hosting candidates and debates, and swinging red for the first time since 2004. Tonight, Iowa Public Television and the Harkin Institute are proud to partner to bring you this evening's program. Now, let me introduce Dennis Goldford. Professor Dennis Goldford has taught political theory and constitutional law at Drake University for more than 30 years. He received a BA in political science and philosophy from the University of Michigan, a Master of Letters in philosophy from Oxford, and an MA and PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. Professor Goldford has written 3 books, most recently, The Constitution of Religious Freedom, God, Politics, and the First Amendment. And he serves regularly as a political analyst for local, regional, national, and international point and broadcast media organizations. In 2015, Professor Goldford began his role as the Harkin Institute's inaugural Flansburg Fellow. The Harkin Institute Flansburg Fellowship was established in December of 2014 in honor of longtime Des Moines Register political reporter Jim Flansburg, who many of you know. And as many of you know, he gained prominence for his reporting on Iowa politics for the Des Moines Register. He is held by many to be one of the best political journalists in the Register's history, which is saying quite a lot. So Professor Goldford has been closely examining modern media's coverage American politics, changes in media coverage, and the implications of those changes for American democratic processes. Now, at the end of his time with the Harkin Institute, he will share with you an overview of his findings. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dennis Goldford.
Thank you. Yes, it has been a tough election season. I've always said I'm 27 years old, and look what it's done to me. I'll tell you. Joseph said I could have 20 minutes, and I tend to say in those circumstances, of course, it takes a professor 15 minutes just to clear his throat. So I'm going to stick to a text, at least talk from a text for you to control my tendency to wander off into some details we can dispense with for right now. And my topic, or at least my title, has always been The Shrinking Extended Republic. Can Madison's constitutional designs survive the modern mass media? I've used the following phrase quite a lot this year. I'm not a media basher, and I've had to raise various issues with mostly broadcast reporters. At one level, I'm a dinosaur. I love the feeling of opening a fresh newspaper in the morning. Unfortunately, there aren't many like me anymore. There may be some like that here in this room. But my major concern is, in a sense, the impact of the modern mass media on certain key elements that Madison designed into our constitutional scheme. So I'm attempting to look at some aspect of contemporary politics in terms of an historical and theoretical context. Now, we've been hearing a lot about so-called information bubbles this election season, particularly since the election itself, people living in their own little media worlds, their own little information worlds. But in fact, there's been research on this phenomenon called more formally epistemic closure. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, for over a decade. And my contribution to the discussion, which is something I've been working on, looking at for really quite a number of years, not unique to this election, has been to look at this phenomenon and its consequences in terms of a central argument that was made in the Federalist Papers, if you remember those important materials in American political thought. Now, contrary to a great deal of often heated rhetoric that we hear at times, the American Constitution was not created and adopted for the purpose of limiting the powers of the national government. We already had a national government of severely limited powers, and everybody agreed they needed to find a way to increase those powers. The caveat, though, was that you've got to make sure that that newly empowered national government does not abuse those increased powers. And in the Federalist Papers, James Madison, along with Alexander Hamilton, before the latter went on to a stage career, proposed two principal methods for preventing such abuse. The first method is what I call a structural one, based upon institutional design, and you can remember your college courses, your high school courses. I'm talking, of course, about separation of powers and federalism. But the second method was not actually the Bill of Rights, the second method of making sure that power could be corralled and controlled. It was not the Bill of Rights, actually, but what I call a sociological approach, with its focus on the theory of what Madison called the extended republic. And so the argument I've been pursuing is that television, talk radio, and the internet appeal by their very nature to emotion and immediacy, rather than to the reasoned reflection and deliberation emphasized by those who wrote and ratified the Constitution. Because of that, they threatened to, so to speak, shrink this extended republic that Madison designed by turning it into a virtual small republic or democracy, and thereby renew on a national scale the possibility of demagoguery and factionalism the sociological approach of Madison was intended to avoid. Now, Madison's argument, I'm sure, is familiar, so I'll just highlight the key elements of it that pertain, again, I think, to the modern mass media. In one of the most famous lines in American political thought, Madison wrote, "By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community." Now, what's significant here is the idea of a majority faction. We normally think of a faction as a special interest, but Madison was saying a majority itself can act as a special interest if it wants to override the rights of the minority. And so this is what he said we need to control, because you can vote out a minority, but if it's the majority that's abusing powers in a republic, that's difficult. Now, given the inevitability of this potential for faction, for people pursuing their self-interest, animated by their own passions and self-interest, he argues the central rationale for the sociological approach, represented by this idea of the extended republic, is this: either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority having such coexistent passion or interest must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. So that was Madison, appeals to considerations of justice, morality, or religion will not suffice to convince members of a majority faction to cease and desist and not abuse their powers. What will convince them to do so, according to Madison, is not the realization that they should not act on these passions and interests, but the realization that they cannot act on these passions and interests. In other words, the advantage offered by what Madison called the extended republic, this broader territory over which we'll have the federal government will have responsibility, the advantage offered by that, he suggested, makes it difficult for potential members of a factional majority to communicate and organize, and keep those two terms in mind, communicate and organize. Now, he says it's precisely the ease of communicating and organizing over a small, limited territory that renders a democracy unable to prevent the formation of factions, renders a democracy subject to tumult and movements that can upset and destabilize everything. A democracy, Madison wrote, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cures for the mischiefs of faction, famous line. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. So he's saying that's Madison. He's saying that, I'm not saying he's the obnoxious individual, that's his words. In the smaller demographically homogeneous face-to-face society, traditionally considered to be necessary for popular self-government, people are more likely to be among family, friends, and acquaintances, and thus more able to communicate and organize. Madison's classic argument, therefore, was this. He said, the smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend the sphere, here's the extended republic idea, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. So the fundamental premise of this argument is that given the greater variety of parties and interests, in Madison's phrase, in an extended republic, there will be no natural national majority. In other words, any national political majority can be only artificial. It'll be, so to speak, a temporary coalition of minorities. But what's more important is that in contrast to the ease of communication and organization possible in a smaller society, the communication and organization necessary for the growth and activity of factions becomes more difficult in a larger society. Madison writes, besides other impediments, it may be remarked that where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. So in other words, if you extend the republic, it's harder for people with nefarious goals to work together and to communicate. So the problem then is, for Madison, is that faction amounts to potential social dynamite. And here's a very important statement from him. He says, a zeal for different opinions, and think again of our political discourse now, a zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government and many other points, as well as of speculation as a practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. But if faction is potentially social dynamite, for Madison and Hamilton, demagoguery is the fuse. Demagoguery is the fuse. Madison was so concerned about the possibility of demagoguery that he considers its prevention one of his justifications for having a Senate. And he says this, as the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought in all governments, and actually will in all free governments, ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers, so there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage, or, and listen to this phrase of his, misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. Hamilton said something similar in regard to having a longer term for the presidency. He says the Republican principle does not require an unqualified complacence or agreement to every sudden breeze of passion or to every transient impulse which the people may receive from the arts of men who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests. It is a just observation that the people commonly intend the public good. This often applies to their very errors. But their good sense would despise the adulator who should pretend that they always reason right about the means of promoting it. Still Hamilton here. They know from experience that they sometimes err, and the wonder is that they so seldom err as they do, the people, beset as they continually are by the wiles of parasites and sycophants, by the snares of the ambitious, the avaricious, the desperate, by the artifices of men who possess their confidence more than they deserve it, and of those who seek to possess rather than deserve it. I mean, consider that language from Madison and Hamilton. That evinces their concern about demagoguery that sparks faction. Now, there have always been demagogues and demagoguery. The etymology of the word refers to in the ancient Greek, refers to a leader championing the cause of the common people in ancient times. Well, that sounds pretty okay. But now, however, the primary definition of a demagogue is a leader who makes use of popular prejudices and false claims and promises in order to gain power. As a noun, a demagogue is a person, especially an orator or political leader, who gains power and popularity by arousing the emotions, passions, and prejudices of the people. As a verb, to demagogue means to treat or manipulate a political issue in the manner of a demagogue, obscure or distort with emotionalism, prejudice, etc. Well, the link between demagoguery and the modern mass media, I suggest, is twofold. First, most people obtain whatever news, information, and opinion they seek from the mass media, by which I mean primarily the broadcast media of network television, but especially cable television, talk radio, and the internet. And such media specialize in immediacy and emotion, rather than the critical distance and sustained reflection and deliberation that enable us to keep the emotion and prejudice characteristic of demagoguery in their place. I mean, think of 9/11. I was teaching a class that morning. Everybody was going on about everybody's business that day everywhere. And of course, we saw the horror on TV. And I told students in my class, I said, watch all the TV you can tonight, but please tomorrow read several newspapers. Because television covers immediacy, emotion, people, events really well. But television doesn't cover issues, ideas, institutions very well. And in a purely, it sounds horrible, but in a coldly analytical sense, watching those jetliners hit the Trade Center was great television. Because what it's conveying, it was hypnotically horrifying. But that's where broadcast focuses on that kind of emotion. So the point there is that this kind of broadcast doesn't foster the kind of dispassionate, careful deliberation that's considered to be so important, at least by the founders. The second problem, perhaps, is even more significant. It's what I call the paradox of the mass media. And several people, I'm not the only one who pointed to this. On the one hand, the mass media give people the potential for coming into a contact with a wider range of news, information, and opinion than they might have encountered or would have been able to access otherwise. I mean, think of what we go check on our internet, on our cell phones and computers. On the other hand, the transition from broadcasting to the fragmentation captured by the term narrowcasting means that this widened range of possible news and information sources has in fact dramatically decreased the likelihood that people will hear alternative points of view. It's crucial to hear alternative points of view to our own. If people hear only their own opinions echoed, the only way they have to explain why someone might think differently is to say that such a person is ignorant, stupid, or evil. That doesn't foster civil discourse. Well, because of the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in the 1980s, no one radio or television station need give an opposing point of view. So while there are more different news and information sources, any particular source will itself likely be one-sided. Citizens now must actively seek out alternative points of view on the issues from a variety of sources, rather than having those alternative points of view appear on each and every source. But the issue then is the extent to which people actually do this. Do they deliberately watch, read, or listen to sources that present alternative points of view? The danger, again, is the possibility that people will simply seek a reinforcement of their views instead of being willing to accept a challenge to their views. As one journalist has written recently regarding the internet, it is a curious quality of the internet that it can be composed of an unfathomable multitude, and at the same time almost always deliver to the user the bits that feed her already held interest and confirm her already held beliefs. Indeed, the shift to the internet as a major source of news, information, and opinion means that people are looking for content. They're looking for content, whereas by thumbing through a newspaper, we're likely to encounter news, information, and opinion for which we weren't looking. That's a helpful thing, to bump into things we really didn't know we were looking for. My point here is that in the extended republic, remember these two terms, that makes communication and organization difficult, people can't help but encounter differing and challenging opinions more readily than similar and or at least just as much as similar and reinforcing opinions. However, someone like Bill Bishop recently, or in the last 10 years, wrote in The Big Sort that Americans have sorted themselves geographically, economically, and politically into like-minded communities over the past 3 decades. Have the mass media been enabling them to do so in the virtual world as well? Are the modern mass media shrinking the extended republic by facilitating the construction of virtual small communities that reinforce one's views and insulate members from serious encounters with alternative views? As Cass Sunstein has written, the problem here comes from the creation of diverse speech communities whose members make significantly different communications choices. A possible consequence is considerable difficulty in mutual understanding. When society is fragmented in this way, diverse groups will tend to polarize in a way that can breed extremism and even in hatred and violence. New technologies, emphatically including the internet, this is still Sunstein, are dramatically increasing people's ability to hear echoes of their own voices and to wall themselves off from others. Well, in fact, and in the paper I wrote, there are all sorts of data suggesting, again, that people tend to go to a particular source that reinforces their particular preconceptions. And in fact, the most politically active people, they have found, the most activist sorts on the liberal side and on the conservative side, are the ones who do this the most. People in the middle tend not to be as uniform, but strong liberals listen to, of course, CNN, MSNBC. Strong conservatives listen even more exclusively to Fox, of course, Fox News, and talk radio especially. So as Politico has said, it's the great irony of the internet era. People have more access than ever to an array of viewpoints, but also the technological ability to screen out anything that doesn't reinforce their views. The effect of these preferences for reinforcement over challenge is to create what Kathleen Jamison and Joseph Capella call an echo chamber. The metaphor of an echo chamber, they write, captures the way messages are amplified and reverberate through the conservative opinion media. That was their focus. We mean to suggest a bounded, enclosed media space that has the potential to both magnify the messages delivered with it and insulate them from rebuttal. Their research focused on conservative media, but they did say on the other side, we find the same protective effect for Democratic claims and corresponding rejection of Republican ones among both CNN viewers and among those who turn their radio dials to NPR. So this rise of these echo chambers, I argue, has the effect of creating virtual communities that shrink the extended republic back to the relatively small homogeneous democracies that Madison contended are a fertile ground for demagoguery and faction and instability. A particular aspect of that is that they foster the media foster the rise of these relatively self-contained virtual communities or echo chambers that undermine the ability of the sociological approach to solve the problem of faction. It's easier to communicate and organize through the internet, as everybody knows, especially with social media. So the extended republic was supposed to make it difficult for people to communicate and organize. But the modern media, fostered certainly on cable and talk radio, but especially the internet, makes it easier to communicate and to organize, which is precisely what Madison and the Federalist papers generally feared. The Washington Post put it this way in a piece in 2013 on conspiracy theories. They said the internet and cable TV have made it far easier to connect with like-minded souls. So, to the extent that people remain within their own partisan and ideological communities, whether actual or virtual, surrounded by like-minded people. And people have broken up friendships lately over partisan issues, right? There's this big joke of how to get through the holidays, and some companies put out something that says, please don't talk to me about the election, to put in your home for Thanksgiving. To the extent that people remain within their own partisan and ideological communities, surrounded by like-minded people that reinforce each other's pre-existing partisan and ideological commitments, again, they become unable to understand how anybody could have an alternative view. And if you think that the only way somebody could do that is because he's morally corrupt or an idiot, that doesn't foster civil discourse. It doesn't allow for compromise, right? And so if the nature of our contemporary mass media is that they operate in such a way that they, in effect, shrink the extended republic down to the turbulent, homogeneous democracies that Madison feared, the question is whether that approach, that constitutional design, still works. Well, to conclude, I'd say for the last half dozen years, I've been telling an anecdote when I've been invited to speak that speaks to my concerns. During the 1996 presidential election, Jack Kemp, the Republican vice presidential nominee, cautioned a supporter who said, we have to defeat our enemies, the Democrats. And Kemp said something tremendously classy and patriotic. He said, no, you're wrong. The Democrats aren't our enemies. Kemp, of course, is Republican. He said, they're our opponents. We're all Americans. My fear is that we don't live in that world anymore. My strong fear is that we don't live in that world anymore. And that's exacerbated by the rise of these echo chambers. Political opponents now consider each other as enemies more frequently. And we even see in the reactions to the results last week, those sorts of extremely angry, antagonistic emotions. The extended republic, the sociological solution to the problem of demagoguery and faction, was supposed to control and be the principal mechanism of controlling this problem of faction and demagoguery. Are cable TV, talk radio, and the internet undermining this? Thank you.